About a month ago, I was sitting on my couch reading a book, and my wife was also sitting in the living room with me reading a book. She put her book down and said to me, "Kevin, you know, I think I'd like a cat." Not gonna lie, this was one of the most surprising things I've heard my wife say in a long time. I've always thought of myself as more of a dog person than a cat person, and I definitely thought my wife was that way too. You see, growing up, she'd had some bad experiences with cats, and whenever I'd even suggested the possibility of getting one, she'd always emphatically said no. So what's changed? She was reading a book that had a cat in it, and she thought the cat seemed like a really nice companion, and she thought, you know, maybe this winter I'd like a little buddy like that myself. And so the next thing I knew, we were on the Humane Society website, and then the next thing I knew after that, we were at the Humane Society. And we then left the Waukesha Humane Society Haws, as it's known, with a little orange tabby kitten, about 4 months old when we got him. Here, let me show you a picture or two of him. So that's my cat. And we picked him up. We left the Humane Society with nothing, no supplies, nothing at home for him. And most of all, we had no idea what we were going to call him. For the first few weeks of having him, I felt like the only two things my wife and I talked about were, one, what do we need to do to make sure we don't kill this cat? And two, what do we call him? We had a bunch of names picked out, but none of the names seemed to fit his personality very well. And finally, we decided upon a name, Leonard, or as we like to call him, Lenny. We named him after Leonard Shelby, who's the main character in the movie Memento. If you haven't seen Memento, Leonard, the main character in this movie, has some sort of brain damage from an accident that causes him to not be able to make new memories. So he only has about 3 minutes of memory, and then his memory resets, and he can't remember anything that just happened. That's kind of what it felt like living with our little Lenny. For one moment, he was cuddly and sweet, and the next moment he was frazzled and running off and hiding under the couch or under the bed. It was as if he couldn't have memory last for more than 5 minutes. And fortunately, a few weeks later, his namesake seems to be less and less relevant. He seems to be more and more trusting with each passing week, but the name Lenny has still stuck. So you see, unlike the character in the movie Memento, Lenny never had any brain damage. He was just scared at first, like how many cats are right when they come to a new home. And I was really struck in these first few weeks with Lenny that fear can make us do some weird things, and sometimes fear can be unpleasant, even sometimes kind of annoying to be around. You know, I've been thinking a lot about fear lately since I've been watching Lenny, my slightly less afraid now, but nevertheless kind of scaredy cat of a cat around my house. And also, I've been thinking about fear a lot because there's a lot of fear in the air right now. There's fear about the election, and there's fear about the state of our country and the fate of our democracy, and fear about the coronavirus and our physical health and our emotional health and our way of life. And with all the incessant political ads and constant news stories about the debates and the president's health, I've been feeling really anxious and on edge lately. I'd venture to guess that many of you are feeling like this too. And from watching my cat's anxiety, I've also observed, like I mentioned a second ago, that fear can be kind of inconvenient or frustrating even at times to be around. Because with Lenny, I so yearned for him just to trust me and know that we weren't going to hurt him, and I wanted to be able to hold him and tell him that it's just going to be okay. But other moments, I just want to shake him and tell him to snap out of him and stop being afraid and just, it's going to be fine. But Lenny's afraid. That's not how fear works. We can't just tell people just to not be in fear anymore. That's just not how fear works. But what do we do with all of this anxiety in the prayer? How, as people of faith, are we called to respond to these threats and these worries and these fears in our world and in our hearts too? I see some people that fill their days with busyness and try and just tune the fear out. I see others that are just constantly frazzled and in a state of just unrest. I see others who are angry, constantly just blaming others, trying to hide their fear. And I see others who just deny their fear altogether and deny and pretend that it's possible to never be afraid and it's always good to not be afraid. And to that perspective, which I feel like I've heard a lot in this season of COVID, let me be clear, it's not always fun to be afraid or to be around people who are feeling afraid, but there's a reason us human beings feel fear. It's the emotion and the natural response we have to dangers and to threats. You're supposed to, for instance, feel afraid if you see a toddler wandering and waddling into oncoming traffic. We're supposed to feel afraid when that happens. Fear isn't bad, it's natural, but the problem is that there are good ways and bad ways of dealing with our fear. And there's also a lot of stories in the Bible about characters who are having to grapple with their own fear. And one of my favorites is the story of Queen Esther. It comes in the book of Esther, named after her. And this book is set when the people of Israel were under the control of the Achaemenid Empire. It's often called the Persian Empire, and that's in modern-day Iran. And the Achaemenid king was a mouthful of a name, Ahasuerus, and this king Ahasuerus was captured by the beauty of a young Jewish orphan girl, Esther. But Esther doesn't reveal her Jewish identity to the king out of fear of what the consequences may be. So she quickly becomes just attracted to the king, and the king is smitten by her. She becomes the queen, but the queen with a secret. Then King Ahasuerus has another character that's worth knowing. It's a trusted advisor named Haman. And Haman didn't trust the Jewish foreigners in the Achaemenid Empire, and he began to blame them for everything that was going wrong in their country. So he began to warn the king of the threat that these foreigners were to the king and to his country. He said things like they don't obey the laws of the land, and they don't practice the same religion as us, and they don't culturally assimilate as much as they should. In short, Haman's position, which he basically says flat out in the book of Esther, chapter 3, verse 8, is fit in or get out. Does that sound like anything you ever hear said today? And it's wild to me how similar Haman's complaints about the Jewish people in the Achaemenid Empire sound like things I hear about foreigners in our public discourse today. But anyways, Haman proposes that the king just wipe out and eradicate and get rid of all the Jewish people in the Achaemenid Empire. And King Ahasuerus was persuaded by Haman's fear-mongering and finger-pointing, and he began to set in motion Haman's plan to get rid of all the Jewish people in the Achaemenid Empire. There's another character that you need to know about in this story. This man is named Mordecai. And Mordecai is another advisor of the king, and he's also Esther's uncle. He's the guy actually who told Esther to be quiet about her Jewish identity. And when Mordecai learned of Haman's plan, he became very publicly distraught. As it was custom for Jews at that time, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and covered himself in ash. And Esther learned of her uncle's very public fear and anxiety and lament. And she encouraged him, like he had told her before, to hide his fear and to hide his true identity as a Jew. But Mordecai doesn't quiet down. In fact, the opposite occurs. Mordecai tells Esther that she needs to speak up and use her position as the queen to protect the very vulnerable Jewish people. And in as many words, Esther replies to Mordecai, "Are you crazy? That would require me putting my neck on the line. Not only am I secretly one of the people that the king wants to get rid of, but no one is allowed to approach the king without his permission. Going to the king without his permission, that's breaking the law. And the Achaemenid Empire is a nation of laws, and we can't do that here. So you're not asking me to break just one law, but 2 laws. And those are 2 things that could get me killed. No, I can't do that. Then comes one of my favorite lines of scripture in the entire Bible. If you're reading along with me, I am in the book of Esther, chapter 4, and I'm starting in verse 12. When they told Mordecai Esther's words, Mordecai had them respond to Esther. Don't think that for 1 minute that unlike all the other Jews, you'll come out of this alive, simply because you are in the palace. In fact, if you don't speak up at this very important time, relief and rescue will appear for the Jews from another place, but you and your family will die. But who knows? Maybe it was for a moment like this that you came to be a part of the royal family. One of the parts of this story that I find most resonant here is that there is not one mention of God. In fact, God is not mentioned once. His name doesn't come up once at all in the whole book of Esther. I find this kind of almost comforting because there's so many stories in the Bible where God addresses people in remarkable ways, in ways that I've never experienced, like God coming to Moses in the burning bush and speaking in a flaming bush that didn't burn up. And to me, it feels more realistic, though, to hear what Mordecai tells Esther. Maybe it was for a moment like this that you became a part of the royal family. Faith amidst fear often emerges amidst uncertainty and confusion, and even at moments where God feels silent, maybe even kind of absent. But the thing that Mordecai says right before this, though, is even closer to the heart of reality than this line that I just read. Mordecai says, relief and rescue will appear. No matter how bad things look, no matter how unsettled we feel, no matter how bad we feel like things are going, God hears our pain. God feels our pain. And God is bringing relief and rescue. There is nothing more true or real or realistic than that. Whether Esther acts courageously or not, God's rescue is coming. But God is inviting Esther to participate in the rescue and in the relief of the Jewish people, a vulnerable people that were at risk and at need. Esther could have downplayed and ignored the risk. That's what she wanted to do at first. She could have hoped that the very real threat of Haman's plot on the king, that she could just hunker down and just fake it till she made it and hope that she could just learn to live with Haman's hate against the Jews, and she could just survive and hope it wouldn't get her too bad. But she wisely knows that just because that she might not be personally affected herself as the queen by Haman's plot does not mean that Haman's threat is any less of a problem or any less possible that he'll come back and get her too. Just because God may feel silent at a particular moment doesn't mean that we are called to remain silent. Sometimes our words, like Mordecai's words to Esther and Esther's words to Mordecai and to King Ahasuerus, are the words that God uses. Even at those moments where we feel over our head and terrified, are moments that God can use to bless those around us, especially those that are most vulnerable and at need. So, let me continue back in the book of Esther, in chapter 4, I'm in verse 16 now. Esther sends this reply to Mordecai. Go, gather all the Jews that are in Susa, that's a big city in the Achaemenid Empire, and tell them to give up eating, to help me be brave. They aren't to eat or drink anything for 3 whole days, and I myself will do the same, along with my female servants. That even though it's against the law, I will go to the king. When Esther asks for the Jewish people to fast with her, and for her sake, she recognizes that bravery isn't something that we do or have to do on our own. And when Esther finally steps forward to approach the king, she did so knowing that God's relief and God's rescue is something that she was doing with the whole people of God. Rescue is something we do together. Relief is something we do together. Bravery is something we do together. Love is something we do together. Protecting and healing also are things we do together. Don't let this country's political discourse at this time mislead you. We are all in this together. Like with Esther, God's rescue and God's relief is coming. And there's space for you in God's rescue. And there's space for you in God's relief. And there's also space for you, like Esther beforehand, to partner with God in bringing rescue and in bringing relief. Even in scary, anxious moments, friends, God's healing is coming. God's healing is coming to you, and God's healing, maybe, just maybe, in moments like this, is coming through you too. Friends, let us join in God's healing, relieving, rescuing work. Amen.